So if we had to wrap it up, if there's one thing, because I feel like we've touched on the adversary, we even touched on the two kingdoms, but maybe wrapping it up, kind of giving a more specific, before we move into how the kingdoms are at war, which I know we've touched on that too, but maybe a little bit more specific identifiers of these two kingdoms and what their goals are, right? So you have God, right? And his goal was obviously, he shows us in Genesis 1 and 2, was goodness, was to rule and reign with a people, a family. But also the goal was to, as I believe, to work out something inside of man so that they could be in eternity with him forever. And how he brings that about, and how he has these two wills that are not in conflict, but they seem in conflict. Like, I don't know, like that's beyond me. But you have this kind of God who is a good father and has this kingdom, and it's for his glory and for our joy. So it's glory and joy and good, and he's going to achieve it. And it's never once has it been in question if he would achieve it. Like, it is achieved. Like, you can't, this adversary, he has been deceived himself, right? He is the great deceiver, but he himself is deceived in thinking that he can actually beat God, that he could.
That's what pride does.
Yeah, it's what pride does for you. It's so silly yeah, it's what pride does, right? So he himself has been deceived, and he is deceiving others in his own deception to think that he actually could take the throne of the God that created him. And so that's God's kingdom, and his kingdom is a deceived kingdom because the ruler of it is deceived himself, right?
Father of lies. The
father of lies, because he's lying to himself, right? And so he's trying to pull. I mean, I don't know. This gets into some spiritual dynamic that we are, we can't possibly understand. But why is he trying to pull as many people as possible? I don't know. Maybe he just likes company. But you do see him. And maybe it's still this bitterness that's just kind of stayed with him from the garden of like, I hate man. He took my spot as the, the right hand of God, like man, crush him, so he loves to watch man in the chaos. Like, he loves to watch man fighting man dissenting from God, man in creation, man corrupting creation in the way that we're supposed to take dominion and take care of the animals in God's world, and instead we have corporate farming, and not to go down that road yet, but we're getting there, how the kingdoms are in conflict. But we have man in our greed and our pride destroying the earth in ways that we do things, and we're destroying our marriage. He's destroying our marriages and all these things. You have these two kingdoms that are at war, and you have one that just wants order and beauty and blessing, and one that wants chaos and destruction and cursing. And these are the two kingdoms. And one's head is God, and one's little head is Satan, the adversary, the great and beautiful cherubim that God created to be beautiful and glorious.
And lead his creation into worship of him.
Yeah, and he dissented, and he's trying to get others to dissent with him. And I feel like we see this story played out in all our movies, like time and time again. It's like we all know this story in our heart.
Well, it defines the tragic nature of our world and the things that do seem to play out in human relational dynamics over and over and over again, because it's built into the dynamic of creation. And I mean, creation is full of these individuals, people, and of course even spiritual beings, like we're talking about, even if we don't understand it. But there's got to be some relational dynamic between everyone involved here, and so there are just types, and that's the reason though it resonates so with us. It's because it's true. It's built into the core of things.
There is no other narrative that resonates so much as the Bible. And it's because the Bible's
defines, true. It defines everything else.
Yeah, and these stories so transcend, and it's just a continual story of humanity over and over and over and over again. And there's so much beauty in it that people just dismiss because we've been, because the deceiver, like you said, has got us to that point to dismiss this. And as we've dismissed it, think about this, as we've dismissed it and dissented from the story that defines us, we have become more lost and more in chaos than we ever have before. All cultures that the gospel, the Bible infiltrates, you start to see come to order, right? All of them. I mean, we could list after list, and we'll talk about that as we get there. But when it gets there, you just see this beautiful order that starts to develop. And when it leaves there, you see this chaos that begins to develop. And it ought to tell us there's a spiritual presence there that's behind the scenes at work, at war, that this physical presence and this material presence is kind of blossoming, right? It's showing the presence of the spiritual that's going on around it.
Yeah, it's here that the evidence, or that we can see, and of course, it could be a two-way street. I mean, in the way that the spiritual realm is intersecting, interacting, influencing this world, but we also see from the Bible that we can in some way engage that world, which is what we are doing.
Yeah.
Certainly when we give our allegiance, our obedience, and through our thoughts, through our words and our deeds, we interact. And when we give in to the lusts of the flesh and the desires, the prideful desires that are aroused in us, then in some way we're given more power and influence to that kingdom and the king or ruler of that kingdom. It's like we're giving him worship and power and authority in that.
Imagine that you're worshiping the deceiver. That'll hold you back a few times from walking in disobedience.
Well, yeah, but that clarity and that's why we're talking about this, to see ourselves in the position, in the situation as we truly are, as revealed in the Bible. And so that we're not lost, so we're not under illusion, so that we're not naive and deceived by it. But we can actually recognize that we're in this state of bondage. That doesn't actually relieve us, because what the Bible says is we're enslaved to this, and we need to be set free. We need to be delivered by a force, a power greater. And that's where God, has not left us here, but has over and over again shown himself to be this deliverer, savior that we need.
And so we've got to the bottom of this kind of subverted triangle, right? Where we had God, man, and the enemy. We had the two kingdoms, how they are to be identified, and then we have this place where it's like the two kingdoms at war. And so now, breaking off from this, what we're going to do as we move forward in Kingdom Come is we're going to identify specific areas of how these two camps are at war, maybe in ways that people haven't necessarily understood how spiritual authorities are affecting and trying to dominate this thing from both sides, such as fatherhood, the role of the father, right, and mother in the home, marriage. Like there's this real spiritual war going on with these things. Complacency, passivity, right? Our movies, right, and our music and art and beauty that God created, right? These things have a war going on, a spiritual element to them that are feeding man. And when one, like you said, when one is upheld, there is something spiritual that is communicated. When you do marriage right, there's a spiritual thing that is communicated to a world with amnesia. And they're like, man, I don't know what that, but that's beautiful. Yeah, that's God, that's order. And when you do marriage wrong, there's chaos that comes into it. There's divorce. There's children that suffer, right? There's consequences. And the enemy celebrates that. And God says, no, that's not what I intended. You were supposed to father the way that I father you, so that the world knows when someone says, Because I know people, man. I know people, you go, God is a father, and they go, well, screw God. I don't want nothing to do with God. And why do they do that? Because their father, they're saying screw you to their own father. That's what they're really doing. And so they don't understand the fatherhood of God and the love of God. And that's why we as Christians, like you're talking about, it's so important that we obey and that we speak out against these things in culture. Not that we passively sideline ourselves and we're like, oh, I don't want to say nothing because I want culture to love me and come to church so that Jesus can save them. No, our job is to take dominion. It's to speak into culture. Culture's not going to accept us. That's not what the Bible teaches. They didn't accept if Jesus would have lived the way sorry, I'm going to get off the page a bit, but if he would have lived the way that modern day culture, evangelical church lives, he would have never been crucified. Ever. They wouldn't have crucified him. He'd been chilling in his 60s and 70s, right? But he didn't do that. He spoke out against culture and the way things that were going. He brought the kingdom in and he said, this is who God is and what God says. And they didn't like him for that. And we, as the church, need to start asking ourselves, is the culture just okay with us? And is that a problem? Because they shouldn't be just okay with us. They ought to some degree hate us in the same way that we ought to feel comfortable in dirty movies and the way we ought to feel comfortable in certain situations. The culture ought to feel uncomfortable with us, with the things that we're saying. And I feel like sometimes we've just become a little too comfortable with the culture and they've become a little too comfortable with us.
Yeah, and
I'm getting ahead of ourselves.
Well, no, it's. I mean, what all this has been about today is laying this foundation for what we hope to talk about and draw out in our conversations is the fact that in the world today, or what defines the world that we live in, is the reality of the Bible, which is two kingdoms warring with one another, but yet God's kingdom is the greatest. It's the first and the last, and Jesus has brought it in and accomplished something in his life and death and resurrection, and his kingdom now has prevailed over this other kingdom. So, that is a emphatic point that has to be understood from a Christian point of view, a biblical point of view, that God's kingdom is ruling. Jesus, the King, is ruling now from a position of power, but there is this other kingdom warring against him, and it's the one that has been warring against God from the beginning and throughout history, including even now, because that is the way that God has chosen for it to work itself out. It appears as if it's ruling, the second kingdom that Satan is in charge of, the kingdom of darkness. It appears as if it is dominant. And in many respects it has been, but yet no longer is he in control. Jesus has all authority. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. So now as Christians, we have the clarity of sight to because of God has revealed these things to us in the scriptures, in this arc of history, that we see things rightly. We see the stage here and the stories and the characters that are at work and the things that are being played out. But we know where the story's going and who's actually in charge of it now. So we can call on Jesus and his power because he wants to bring more and more and more and more of the reality and truth of his kingdom to bear in this world. And so part of the illusion that we're under is his church and his people in the world is we don't think that we have that authority and power. And I'm not talking about like, a name it, claim it kind of pray for whatever you want, right, and you're going to, get that new car or something. No, but we have the authority, and Jesus has taught us to pray in his name, in his authority. in the name of his kingdom to see the things that his kingdom is about to come to bear in the world. And so that's where we as New Testament Christians can realize that we are, and we ought to then act more from that place, not passively, but assertively, authoritatively, confidently, in strength, not naively, under a false impression, but also not like weakly or timidly. And there's a difference in having like humility, because we know that this is only God's doing, and we're at his feet, and we're his servants in this.
Yes.
But he is in charge. He's ruling. And so the things that matter to God in these areas of dominion that his people ought to be ruling in his name over, and in so doing, when we do it, it gives a true accurate testimony to who he is, and it brings his kingdom into the world. And we have the opportunity to do that in all these spheres of life. And then what we're saying is, as his people, we ought to have a burden to see more of that. Jesus told us to pray this way, and not to just passively wait. Yes, this world and this creation as it exists is passing away, so our hope is not here. But yet, because our hope is anchored in Jesus and where he is now, and that end result, or whenever God, it's the bringing of his kingdom into this world, restoring us back to kind of that original mandate. And whatever exactly that means and looks like, and whatever it ought to, that's what we want to know. And we don't want to sit around and just wait on it so much when Jesus has told us
not to.
He's commanded us to go and live in such a way and pray.
Sure.
And that's where the prayer comes in, as not this secondary thing that we kind of do, but if the fact that the spiritual realm, if that reality is over, it's greater in a sense, and influences and defines it, then we're gonna believe that, and we're gonna call out into it in the name of the Lord, and ask for his power and might to come into this world and accomplish the will that he hopes to see, and to use us for it.
Yeah, and you have these two camps, right? You have these two camps like, but God is sovereign. He's sovereign, and we say yes to that. And then you have this other camp that's like, but we need to pray, right? And it's like, we say yes to that. And it seems as if these two things are like, but how can you have a all-powerful God at the helm of this thing that has already accomplished all these things, and then here he is as man saying pray? It's like, why? There is this kind of like pushback to like, why pray? I thought you accomplished it. I thought you're in control. And that's where the I don't know, but he said do it, so you better do it, right? Like there's something going on here. Like God, we still say yes to all you Reformed people out there that are like, well, God's sovereign. I'm Reformed too, calm down. I know, I get it. I've been there, like God's sovereign, but still there's something about prayer, because Jesus said, pray this way. And it's like, it's kind of like, whoa, like, okay, like pray this way. So there's something there, like you're talking about. Even though if it's not fully realized over what it is doing, there is something there. But we don't want to get to the far end of the camp of going, but we got to pray, because if we don't pray, God's not going to accomplish. Right? We're not saying that, but there's something in this interesting thing that seems to not fit. It fits, although we can't understand how it fits. And I'm okay with saying that. I don't know how it fits. I don't.
It's why, though, we can pray and ought to pray boldly, is because God is sovereign over it and is working something out. And the prayer is the invitation to align our hearts with his, and have our hope be in the coming of his kingdom more fully on the earth, and to participate with him in making that happen. And when you really believe God, then you are excited to hope in those things and call on him for it. And you see areas of the world, and there's no lack of that, where there's a desperate need for God to come. And so perhaps it's so out of whack and so so much not how it should be because there's not people praying for it. And so in this day and time, there's this opportunity for us and
to take part in the. You may feel like you are insignificant. I know so many people feel that way sometimes. They see celebrities and but he has such a platform and they have such this and I just don't have that. No one really even knows me. I'm insignificant. I truly do believe that in the new kingdom and the new earth, in the new heavens and the new earth, in the new kingdom, that history is going to be rewritten. And it's not going to be rewritten based upon the size of your ministry. That's not what it's going to be rewritten over. It's going to be rewritten over the obedience of the man. Were you obedient with the role that God gave you? And sometimes it's the hardest to be obedient when it's not recognized by the world. Right? We live in a world that is full of recognition, mainly because we're trying to make a name for ourselves, and we need to understand that, right? Social media, I got this many followers, or we look at Billy Graham and we're like, man, I can never accomplish Billy Graham's ministry. You're right, you can't. And Billy Graham couldn't have accomplished it either if God didn't make sure that he did, right? And so it's like, don't base this upon the numbers. It's not about numbers. It's about obedience. Maybe God called you to sit in your prayer closet every day, and that's your calling, and no one will ever know on this earth what you've done in the kingdom, in the spiritual realm. I have a grandma that most people don't know anything about what she's done, but when she gets to the kingdom, man, she's going to be blessed because that woman is a prayer warrior, right? And she has answered her call, right? And nobody knows about it, but her status in the new kingdom, and there's going to be status, she's going to have a planet. Like she's getting a planet, you know what I mean? Like, I'm just going to tell you, but we need to get to that place where we're okay with what God has called us to do. And if it's something that it's okay. Just be obedient to the call that God has in your life. And it's in baby steps that we walk into that obedience. And I think God has been working in your heart in that area. I know he has mine. Like that, to getting us to this place where we're just okay. If this is a podcast of 5 people, we're okay with that, and we'll minister to you 5 people for the rest of time. Like that's all it's got to be. It ain't the numbers game.
That's all.
Yeah, I mean that's what we talked about. These conversations only bless us. Like we don't care if y'all listen or not. I mean, listen, it'd be cool. But if you don't, like it's all right. You know what I mean? Like this is just where it's us being obedient to the call that God's put in our life to do these videos and these podcasts, to talk about these things, to flush them out for ourselves, for our son's sake. Like we might have 3 followers one day, 3 boys, and that's it. That's okay. Right? That's all we need. Our wives will tune in from time to time when they're happy with us or not.
But I mean, in the scripture, throughout calls God's people, like you're saying, to be faithful with what he gives you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I've discovered this in my own life, and it's still working itself out. But where my prideful, vain ambition is present, and I'm seeking and pursuing life to gratify my own goals, and then God comes along and begins to sanctify what that means. And so it's hard to discern sometimes what is, what do I want or what ought I pursue for my sake or for God's sake, or what does that look like? And even the process is a process in the journey that we're on, and sanctifying takes time. But in it, one of the most major revelations of it for me that's provided a lot of contentment and peace is knowing that I don't have to accomplish anything. Jesus has accomplished what matters most, what is by far the most glorious thing that a human being could do. And he did it through this way of sacrifice in total obedience to his Father, came not for his will, but for the will of the Father, out of love. And he gives his life sacrificially. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life to buy back the people that were his enemies. They're in bondage, and he came to rescue that kind of people. And so that just...
So that we could live in obedience.
And that blows out of the water whatever vain ambition I have for my life. And so I want to be able to serve that and somehow model my own life and existence on that. But Jesus also said, greater things will we do than, and it's better that he goes so that his Spirit will come and work in us. So as we're exploring what that means, we just want to humbly seek Jesus and trust that he will then position us, work life out around us, that he's made each of us uniquely with certain gifts and talents and abilities to go out into the world and to accomplish the mandate and the mission that he's given us. And if we find ourselves lost in it, then it's real easy to get reoriented in that. Just look to him, and remember that it's about him, and
and there is this, and that is like you're saying, like, what better story to be caught up in, like, than the epic narrative that's unfolding. I mean, I don't mean to get off subject, I don't want to, but you see this call of the human heart and how infatuated we are with movies and video games and all of these things that are getting us, what we're getting caught up in is in the narrative and in the movie itself. We want to be these characters, right? We want to, and what we're so deceived in is that we are in an epic narrative that so surpasses anything that you're watching that you want to be caught up in. And it's about living in obedience to the kingdom of God or to the kingdom of the deceiver, the adversary. And it's like, you're in this narrative. Whether you know it or not, you're in it, man. And it's unfolding, and there is nothing greater than to be caught up in that.
We're seeking this excitement, the thrill of living. We want, but the reason that the movies and the drama of it appeals and arouses these desires in our hearts, like you're saying, we long for it, but then the enemy comes along and snatches it. And it's a pure, good, righteous desire down in there somewhere, but the enemy takes it and leads it the wrong way, and then tells you that this is the way that you fulfill that, or this way or that way, through money, through sex, through your career ambitions, through family, even through the good things that God has given us, but we pursue it for our own ambition and desire and glory versus that of God, where the same, and again, what the enemy in his lies, he convinces us that the things that God has designed to give us and to provide structure and stability for the creation. So you got family, the family unit, community, society, governance, those kind of things that are there to enable us
to take dominion.
To take dominion, to carry out, and to live out personally, individually, our calling in that, but to do it along the righteous means that God provides and establishes. The enemy comes in and corrupts all that, and we're in it still, but we're operating in it with dysfunction, and therefore the whole system of it malfunctions over and over again. But then our own dysfunction keeps us in a perpetual negative downward cycle that plays itself out in all these spheres of life, between father and son, mother and daughter, the family dynamic, the workplace, whatever
government.
It is. I mean, in business and all these things where we're pursuing what God has designed for us, and that's by God's grace. He's let us get this far in it, but we run into the obstacles, the dead ends, or we continually kind of self-sabotage ourselves and wonder why, God, do I keep finding myself stuck? Why do I keep making these same mistakes? Why can't I get ahead? And it's because we're following the wrong instructions. We're captivated by the wrong story, and we're trying to make ourselves the star, or we're idolizing some false star in it all. When God himself, like you're saying, is calling us in, and then because there's so much need in today's world and in its fallen state for redemption, there is the time of your life waiting for you. An adventure is ahead of you if you step into Jesus' calling. And it's not an easy one, but it's righteous. And you get to be the hero. You have the opportunity to live out chivalry and nobility and all these things by doing good in the world. But yet the enemy's convinced us that, oh, that's boring. That's lame.
Yeah.
That's old school.
Yeah.
That's too
Yeah.
traditional. You need to live life on
That's
edge.
uncourageous.
Yeah, you need to take on this risk. It's exciting. It's thrilling.
And we can see through that lie, right? We can see through that lie. All you have to do is walk into a certain place where the world has dominated it and see how fearful it becomes to stand on truth. Because it's like, oh yeah, man, this takes a lot of courage, and I don't know if I'm ready to do this, right? So we like that being displayed in the movie, but when we're actually called to do that, we're like, I like to play it on a video game instead. That's a lot easier. Can I just hit A, B, C? Like, it's like the video game was easier. And so I think we escape in those places because it's easy to be, there's no courage in a video game. You have to actually have courage to step into culture and go, this is what's true. And so I think you just wrapped up like the very point of that triangle in the dot of it so that we can start to move into how the enemy has infiltrated the camps that God meant to institute and as you were saying, take dominion over the earth in the way that he's called us to do it, and how the enemy just kind of flies in there and mess them up. And so that's where we'll kind of take off next week in one of those areas, and maybe even headship. Maybe that's a good place to start because that's what God kind of told us to be in husbands and fathers, and how the enemy is came in and destroyed that or corrupted that, and how what the consequences have been of that. Maybe that's a great place to.
And what the enemy wants to do, and has successfully done, is compartmentalize all these spheres of life.
Yeah.
And one of the things that through this conversation today is that we're trying to say is that no, they're not separate and compartmentalized. They overlap.
As I just compartmentalized one of them.
Well, but we can talk about them, but and that I'm saying this in response.
Yeah.
They're not separate. They
Sure.
influence everything, influences and affects everything. And Jesus is
Yeah.
the king over it all. We don't have our own little private spiritual religious life over
Right.
here. No, and there's no real separation of church and state and business and all these things.
No.
Jesus rules the universe
Yes.
and our world
Yeah.
and our lives, and we need to be submitted to him. And so what we want to consider is, how do we do that in every sphere of life? What does it mean for his kingdom to come?
Yeah.
And
because it is coming. Like whether you
It's
want
coming.
to
It's
take
here. It's here.
whether you want to take part whether you want to take part in it now or not, like it's coming, it's here, and Jesus is coming back on a white horse with a robe dipped in blood and a sword, and he is going to take back the new kingdom of the
Yeehaw.
Boom.
Yeehaw. Let's do it.
I think that was at least 2 hours.